Imagine a world where knowledge is power, yet half the population is systematically shut out. Imagine a time when the greatest minds of the era are gathering, sharing ideas, and shaping the future, but only if you possess a certain biological trait. How did it happen? Why were women, despite their intelligence and capabilities, barred from the burgeoning centers of higher learning in the year 1188? Number 1. Logistical and institutional barriers. Step into a time machine with us, back to the twilight years of the 12th century, specifically the year of our Lord 1188. It is a time of shifting sands, a period where the ancient traditions of cloistered learning are beginning to give way to something new, something revolutionary, the university. But let us be clear, the universities of 1188 were not like the sprawling campuses you might picture today, with their diverse student bodies and myriad departments. No, these were nascent institutions, often growing organically from cathedral schools or monastic centers, or emerging from groups of masters and scholars who gathered together, much like a guild of artisans. They were in their very DNA, designed for a specific kind of person, pursuing a specific kind of knowledge for a specific kind of life. And almost without exception, that person was male. Consider the very practical challenges. Let us paint a picture of a hypothetical, bright, curious young woman in a small village, say, somewhere in the heart of France, with a keen intellect and a thirst for knowledge. How would she even begin to access higher learning? The centers of study, like the nascent University of Paris or the schools of Bologna, were not within easy walking distance. Travel in 1188 was perilous. Roads were often little more than rutted tracks, prone to mudslides, banditry, and the whims of nature. For a woman, particularly an unchaperoned woman, undertaking such a journey was fraught with danger. It was not merely uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. The societal norms of the time dictated that a respectable woman, especially one of any social standing, would not travel alone. She would be accompanied by family members, servants, or a religious escort. The idea of a young woman embarking on such a journey solely for intellectual pursuits was simply unimaginable to most, let alone permissible by her family or community. The very physical act of getting to a place of learning was a colossal, almost insurmountable, hurdle. Then there is the matter of accommodation. Universities, as they were evolving, often provided communal living arrangements for their students, or students would lodge in various houses within the town. These were overwhelmingly male environments. Student life, as records from the period indicate, could be rowdy, boisterous, and entirely unsuitable for the presence of women, particularly young women from respectable families. There were no dormitories for female students, no separate colleges, no provisions made for their presence. The concept simply did not exist. The institutions were built by men, for men, within a society that segregated the sexes in almost every public sphere. To introduce women into these living and studying arrangements would have required a complete reimagining of the social order, an upheaval that was simply not on the radar of anyone in power during this era. The very architecture of learning, the physical spaces themselves, were unwelcoming and unaccommodating to the female presence. Furthermore, let us consider the economic realities. Higher education, even in its rudimentary form, was not free. Students typically paid fees to masters for lectures and instruction, who was expected to bear this cost. Traditionally, it was the family, often investing in a son who was destined for a career in the church, the burgeoning legal profession, or royal administration. These were the pathways to social mobility and influence that higher learning could unlock. For a daughter, such an investment would have been seen as utterly illogical, a colossal waste of resources. What return could a family expect on such an investment? There were no professional pathways for learned women, as we will explore further. Therefore, the financial backing that allowed men to pursue studies was simply not extended to women. The economic structure of families and society simply did not support female academic pursuits. A woman's dowry, her contribution to a marriage, was her family's primary economic investment in her future, not her education. Think about the institutional structure itself. Early universities were not centrally organized entities with a clear admissions process as we understand it today. They were more like guilds of masters and scholars, or they grew out of ecclesiastical schools. Admission to these circles often involved an apprenticeship with a master, followed by a formal examination, which then conferred the right to teach. These were closed shops, so to speak, predominantly male-dominated and exclusive. To become a master, one had to participate in debates, give lectures, and engage in the scholarly life, all of which occurred in public, male-only spaces. There was no precedent, no mechanism, and certainly no desire within these emerging institutions to integrate women into their ranks. The very notion of a female scholar, or female master, challenging the established order of these academic guilds was a foreign concept, utterly outside the prevailing intellectual and social paradigm. The rules, unspoken and unwritten, were nevertheless incredibly rigid and clear. This was a male domain. Moreover, the curriculum itself was often deeply intertwined with ecclesiastical studies. Theology, canon law, and medicine, which often had a strong philosophical and classical component, were the primary subjects. To study theology often meant to prepare for ordination into the priesthood, a path unequivocally closed to women. To study canon law was to prepare for roles within the church bureaucracy or legal administration, again, roles traditionally held by men. While there might have been some lay students, the predominant influence and structure were clerical. This clerical underpinning of higher education in 1188 further reinforced its male exclusivity. The very purpose of university education was to train men for the key roles of society, roles from which women were entirely absent. Consider also the sheer lack of precedent. There were no female scholars graduating from previous generations of institutions to inspire or pave the way for others. While there might have been a few isolated instances of exceptionally learned women within convents, or noblewomen who pursued private tutoring in literacy and piety, these were not examples of women engaging in formal higher learning within university settings. There was no established tradition, no societal expectation, and absolutely no institutional push for female education beyond basic literacy and religious instruction for noblewomen or practical skills for peasant women. The institutions themselves, still in their infancy, were simply reflecting and reinforcing the deeply ingrained societal norms of their time, norms that simply did not include women in the pursuit of higher, formal academic knowledge. They were, in essence, self-perpetuating male enclaves, evolving from a male-dominated past into a male-dominated future. Number 2, absence of professional paths and practical application. Let us continue our journey into the societal landscape of 1188, a landscape where every role, every aspiration, every future had its assigned place, particularly for women. For men, the pursuit of higher learning, as rudimentary as it was in the emerging universities, was often seen as a direct pathway to a particular career. It was a vocational training, a means to an end. You studied theology to become a priest, a bishop, or a prominent church administrator. You delved into canon law and civil law to become a lawyer, a judge, or a royal advisor. You might even study medicine to become a physician, a respected professional in a world where disease was a constant threat. These were the esteemed, socially recognized, and often lucrative professions that demanded formal education. And for women, none of these doors were open, not a single one. So let us ask the pivotal question. If a woman were to gain a university education in 1188, what exactly would she do with it? The answer, in the societal context of the time, was absolutely nothing. There was no recognized profession, no esteemed role, no public office that a learned woman could occupy. Imagine, if you will, a woman emerging from Bologna with a deep understanding of Roman law, or from Paris with an unparalleled grasp of scholastic theology. Where would she apply this knowledge? She could not enter the clergy, for that was exclusively male. She could not argue cases in court, as women were generally barred from public legal roles, and even from acting as witnesses in many instances. She could not serve as a royal chancellor or a bureaucratic administrator, for these were positions of male authority. Even in the field of medicine, while women often served as midwives or informal healers within their communities, the formal, university-trained physician was an exclusively male domain. The very concept of a female doctor in the academic sense was beyond the societal imagination. Knowledge, in the medieval context, was largely utilitarian. It was valued for what it could achieve, for the practical benefits it could confer upon the individual, and, by extension, upon the institutions of power, the church, the monarchy, the burgeoning city-states. If a man devoted years to studying logic, rhetoric, and law, it was understood that he was preparing himself for a life of service that would bring him status, income, and influence. For women, their value was primarily defined by their domestic roles, managing a household, bearing and raising children, maintaining family lineage, and upholding household piety. These roles, while profoundly important to the functioning of society, did not require formal academic training. The skills necessary for these roles were passed down through generations, learned within the home, or acquired through practical experience. A woman's education, if she received any beyond basic literacy and religious instruction, was typically focused on needlework, music, household management, and perhaps basic arithmetic for estate management for noblewomen. These were considered appropriate accomplishments, complementing her prescribed role. Consider the expectations placed upon women. A woman's primary duty was to marry and bear children, particularly sons, to continue the family line. Her reputation, her honor, and her economic security were intrinsically tied to her marital status and her perceived purity. A woman who devoted herself to scholarly pursuits, who neglected the traditional female arts, might be seen as aberrant, unfeminine, or even dangerous. Such a woman might struggle to find a suitable husband, as her intellectual pursuits would likely be seen as a detriment rather than an asset in a potential wife. Family would not invest in her higher education because it did not contribute to her marriage prospects, which were the primary concern for most families regarding their daughters' futures. Even for women of the highest social standing, the options were limited. A noblewoman might oversee a vast estate, manage servants, and perhaps even have a degree of influence over her husband's affairs. But her authority stemmed from her social position and her marital connection, not from formal academic credentials. While some noblewomen were highly literate and even patronized scholars or possessed significant libraries, their learning was almost always pursued privately, often under the guidance of a chaplain or tutor, and rarely with a view to participating in the public academic sphere of the universities. Their knowledge served to enhance their personal piety, their ability to manage complex households, or their capacity to engage in sophisticated conversation, not to enter a profession. The very concept of a career for a woman, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Life was defined by family, by household, by community, and by the strictures of the church. A woman's sphere was the domestic sphere, however grand or humble that might be. Men, on the other hand, operated in the public sphere, where higher learning was becoming an increasingly valuable tool for advancement. The universities, in their very essence, were training grounds for these male-dominated public roles. Without any corresponding roles for women, there was no societal impetus, no personal ambition, and no economic justification for a woman to seek higher education. Practical application of such learning was simply non-existent within the existing social and economic structures of 1188. It was a system that, by its very design, offered no space for the learned woman outside of a few exceptional, usually religious, contexts which were far removed from the emerging university model. Number 3, protection of purity and morality concerns. Now, let us delve into an aspect of medieval society that was profoundly influential, almost omnipresent, in shaping the lives of women: the intense preoccupation with female purity and morality. In the world of 1188, a woman's honor, her family's standing, and her very future were inextricably linked to her chastity. This was not merely a social expectation, it was a deeply ingrained moral and religious imperative, influencing every facet of a woman's existence, including, crucially, her access to education. The emerging universities, as centers of male interaction and intellectual ferment, were simply deemed too dangerous, too morally compromising, for the delicate virtue of women. Imagine a bustling medieval town where a nascent university is taking root. Picture the narrow, crowded streets, the taverns filled with boisterous students, the lecture halls where young men debated theology or law with passionate intensity. This environment, for many, was seen as a hotbed of potential moral transgression. Students, often young and away from the direct supervision of their families for the first time, were known for their lively and sometimes unruly behavior. Records from the period, such as town ordinances and university statutes, occasionally hint at concerns regarding student conduct, including drinking, gambling, and interactions with women of ill repute. While these descriptions might exaggerate, they highlight a societal anxiety about uncontrolled male behavior. The concern for female purity was paramount. A young, unmarried woman's virginity was her most valuable asset, essential for securing a good marriage and maintaining her family's honor. Any perceived threat to this purity, any hint of impropriety, could irrevocably damage her reputation and her prospects. The very idea of placing a young woman in an environment where she would interact freely and unsupervised with scores of young men, away from the protective gaze of her family, was considered utterly scandalous and reckless. It was believed that such an environment would expose her to temptation, to unwanted advances, and potentially to the ruin of her honor. Society, by and large, chose to err on the side of extreme caution, effectively creating a cordon sanitaire around the institutions of higher learning to protect female virtue. This protective instinct was not necessarily born of malice, but rather from a profound societal anxiety. It was a reflection of the patriarchal structure that placed immense responsibility on men to control and protect female sexuality, and on women to maintain their own virtue. Perceived fragility of female virtue was a common trope in medieval thought, often linked to the story of Eve and the concept of women as inherently more susceptible to temptation. Therefore, to expose women to an environment that was not strictly controlled and segregated was seen as inviting disaster. The risk, in the eyes of society, was simply too great. It was better to exclude women entirely than to risk the moral downfall of even one. Furthermore, the public nature of university life was problematic. Lectures were often held in communal halls, debates were public spectacles, and students and masters engaged in lively discourse in public squares or taverns. For a woman to participate in such public intellectual life was seen as immodest, even audacious. A woman's place was primarily within the domestic sphere, or if in public, always under strict supervision. To allow women into the public, intellectual domain of the university would have been to challenge deeply ingrained notions of female propriety and decorum. It would have blurred the lines between the private, feminine world and the public, masculine world in a way that medieval society found deeply unsettling. The spiritual implications also played a significant role. The Church, as the supreme moral authority, heavily emphasized the importance of chastity, especially for women. Many of the early universities were closely tied to the Church, either directly through their origins in cathedral schools or indirectly through their curriculum and the clerical status of many of their masters and students. The moral teachings of the Church reinforced the idea that mixed-gender public spaces posed a spiritual danger to women. To preserve their souls and to prevent sin, segregation was often deemed necessary. The emphasis on celibacy for clergy and the monastic ideal further solidified the notion of male-only spaces as conducive to spiritual and intellectual purity. This concern for purity also extended to the reputation of the institutions themselves. To admit women would have meant introducing an element of perceived moral instability, potentially inviting criticism and undermining the nascent respectability of these new centers of learning. They were striving to establish themselves as serious places of study, training the future leaders of church and state. Any scandal involving female students would have been deeply damaging to their burgeoning reputations. Therefore, the path of least resistance, and the path most aligned with prevailing social and religious norms, was to maintain absolute gender segregation within the academic sphere. It was a protective barrier, built not of brick and stone, but of societal anxiety, moral stricture, and deeply held beliefs about female virtue, effectively barring women from the pursuit of higher learning. Number 4. Religious interpretations and theologian views. In the year 1188, the Church was not merely a powerful institution, it was the bedrock of Western European society, its doctrines permeating every aspect of life, from governance to daily customs, and most certainly to education. Prevailing theological interpretations and the views of influential church fathers and scholars played an incredibly significant role in shaping perceptions of women, often casting them in a light that systematically excluded them from intellectual pursuits, particularly those associated with the sacred and learned domains. These views were not just opinions, they were seen as divine truths, reinforced by scriptural interpretations and centuries of tradition. At the heart of many medieval arguments against women's public and intellectual roles lay the biblical narrative of creation and the fall. The story of Eve being fashioned from Adam's rib, and then, crucially, succumbing to the serpent's temptation and leading Adam into sin, was interpreted in ways that had profound implications for women. Eve's actions were often cited as evidence of women's inherent moral weakness, their susceptibility to deception, and their potential to lead men astray. This narrative cast a long shadow, fostering a perception of women as inherently less rational, more emotional, and less spiritually robust than men. If a woman was prone to sin, easily swayed, and a source of temptation, how could she be trusted with the weighty matters of theology, philosophy, or law, which demanded rigorous intellect and moral rectitude? Influential theologians and philosophers of the era, whose writings formed the intellectual backbone of the emerging universities, often articulated views that reinforced these perceptions. While figures like Thomas Aquinas would largely shape scholastic thought in the century following 1188, the foundational ideas were already firmly in place. Earlier church fathers, such as Tertullian, Augustine of Hippo, and Jerome, had already laid much of the groundwork. For instance, Tertullian famously admonished women as the devil's gateway, responsible for the fall. Augustine, while acknowledging the spiritual equality of men and women before God, nonetheless emphasized women's subordinate role in the earthly order, often linking it to their physical and intellectual capacity. These revered voices, whose works were diligently studied in monastic and cathedral schools that predated and influenced the universities, provided a theological justification for the exclusion of women from positions of authority, teaching, and ultimately, higher learning. The concept of women's spiritual role was also a critical factor. While women could certainly achieve great piety and even sainthood, their spiritual path was generally understood as distinct from that of men. Priesthood, the ultimate calling for men in the church, was unequivocally closed to women, based on interpretations of scripture and apostolic tradition. Since much of higher learning, particularly theology and canon law, was designed to train future clergy, the exclusion of women from ordination naturally extended to their exclusion from the educational pathways leading to it. If a woman could not preach, administer sacraments, or lead congregations, what purpose would a theological degree serve her? The very nature of the curriculum in places like Paris was geared towards producing men for sacred service, a service from which women were barred. Consider also the prevailing understanding of hierarchy, which was deeply embedded in medieval thought, both secular and religious. The universe was seen as an orderly creation of God, with a clear chain of being and divinely ordained social structure. Within this hierarchy, men were generally seen as superior to women, mirroring the relationship between Christ and the Church, or God and humanity. This hierarchical view extended to intellectual capacity and leadership. It was believed that men possessed a greater capacity for reason and abstract thought, making them naturally suited for intellectual leadership and the rigorous demands of philosophical and theological inquiry. Women, while acknowledged as capable of domestic wisdom and emotional depth, were not seen as possessing the same intellectual gifts necessary for the highest forms of academic pursuit. Even for women who chose a religious life, for instance, entering a convent, their education, while often extensive in literacy, Latin, and religious texts, was typically geared towards piety, scripture, and managing the internal affairs of the convent. It was not intended to prepare them for public disputation, for teaching in a university setting, or for engaging in the kind of systematic, scholastic inquiry that characterized male higher education. While figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who lived earlier in the 12th century, demonstrated extraordinary intellectual and spiritual prowess, she was an exception, operating within the specific confines of her monastic order, not within the burgeoning university system. Her learning, while profound, did not open the door for other women to enter the universities. Ultimately, the deeply entrenched religious interpretations and theological views of the time provided a formidable barrier. It created a moral and intellectual framework that justified women's exclusion from the public sphere of knowledge and power. It was not just a societal preference, it was seen as God's divine order, reinforced by respected authorities and centuries of tradition, making the very idea of women in higher learning not just unusual, but potentially ungodly or unnatural. Number 5, perceived intellectual and physical inferiority. Let us now journey into the realm of medieval scientific and philosophical thought, specifically as it applied to the human body and mind. In 1188, understanding of anatomy, physiology, and psychology was vastly different from our modern scientific knowledge. It was heavily influenced by classical Greek and Roman ideas, filtered through Christian theology, and often interpreted in ways that profoundly reinforced gender distinctions. Central to this was the widespread belief in the inherent intellectual and physical inferiority of women, a perception that served as a powerful justification for their exclusion from higher learning. Dominant medical theory of the time was humoral theory, derived from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later refined by Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of four cardinal humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Balance of these humors determined a person's temperament, health, and even intellectual capacity. According to this theory, women were generally considered to be cooler and wetter in temperament than men. This humoral imbalance was believed to make them physically weaker, less rational, more prone to emotional swings, and generally less capable of sustained intellectual effort. Men, being warmer and drier, were seen as naturally possessing greater strength, courage, and crucially, a superior capacity for reason. This perceived physiological difference translated directly into assumptions about intellectual prowess. If a woman's brain was believed to be cooler and wetter, it was therefore considered less suitable for abstract thought, logical reasoning, and the rigorous demands of philosophical or theological debate. Learning, particularly the kind of demanding academic study offered in the emerging universities, was thought to require intense concentration, logical precision, and a dispassionate intellect qualities that were largely attributed to men. Women, on the other hand, were often characterized as being more intuitive, more emotional, and better suited for practical domestic concerns rather than abstract intellectual pursuits. The very idea of a woman engaging in complex scholastic disputations, which were a cornerstone of medieval university life, would have seemed utterly incongruous with their perceived intellectual makeup. Consider the medical and philosophical texts that were studied and debated in the early universities. Works by figures like Aristotle, whose ideas were being rediscovered and integrated into Christian thought, heavily influenced these views. Aristotle, for instance, considered women to be mutilated males, an incomplete or less perfect form of humanity. While medieval Christian thinkers reinterpreted some of Aristotle's ideas through a theological lens, the underlying notion of female biological inferiority persisted. This was not a fringe view. It was embedded in the scientific and philosophical understanding of the human body and mind prevalent among the educated elite of the time. These ideas were discussed and taught, reinforcing the notion that women were simply not equipped, by their very nature, for the rigors of higher intellectual pursuits. Furthermore, there was a concern that intense study could be detrimental to a woman's physical health and her primary biological function, childbearing. It was widely believed that rigorous intellectual activity could divert vital energies away from the reproductive organs, potentially harming a woman's fertility or making her an unsuitable wife and mother. Focus for women was on nurturing life, not on developing abstract thought. A woman who was too learned might even be seen as unnatural, someone who had transgressed the natural order of her being. This perception reinforced the idea that female education should be limited to that which supported her domestic and spiritual roles, rather than the expansive knowledge offered in universities. The delicate nature often attributed to women also played a part. The university environment, with its long hours of study, demanding debates, and sometimes harsh living conditions, was seen as physically taxing. Women were perceived as too frail, too delicate, to withstand such rigor. This was coupled with the societal expectation that women should remain modest and secluded, particularly those of higher social standing. Public, often boisterous, atmosphere of university life would have been deemed unsuitable for their supposed physical and moral delicacy. It is important to remember that these were not merely prejudices, but were presented as scientific and philosophical truths, derived from accepted medical theories and classical authorities. They were part of the intellectual currency of the age, deeply influencing how society viewed gender roles and capabilities. Thus, the exclusion of women from higher learning was not just a social convention. It was justified by what was considered the prevailing understanding of human nature, a nature that, in the eyes of medieval scholars, simply did not equip women for the rigorous demands of university life and intellectual mastery. This pervasive belief in women's inherent intellectual and physical inferiority provided a powerful, seemingly irrefutable, rationale for their exclusion. Number 6. Societal roles in the domestic sphere. let us cast our minds back to the year 1188 and consider the fundamental structure of medieval society, particularly the division of labor and expectations based on gender. In this era, society was profoundly stratified and roles were rigidly defined, largely by tradition, custom, and the prevailing religious and philosophical beliefs. For women, their primary and overwhelmingly dominant role was within the domestic sphere. This foundational societal expectation, more than any other factor, fundamentally precluded their access to formal higher education, which was, by contrast, an enterprise of the public sphere. From the moment a girl was born, her future trajectory was largely predetermined. For the vast majority, this meant a life centered around the home, family, and household management. Whether she was a peasant girl toiling in the fields and raising children, or a noblewoman overseeing a vast estate with numerous servants, her responsibilities were almost exclusively tied to the domestic realm. Her education, if she received any beyond basic literacy, was informal and practical. A peasant girl learned to churn butter, spin wool, tend to livestock, cook, clean, and care for infants by observing and assisting her mother. A noblewoman learned to manage a household, perhaps basic arithmetic for accounts, needlework, music, and social graces appropriate for her station, often under the tutelage of a governess or elder female relatives. These skills were considered entirely sufficient and indeed essential for her future as a wife and mother. The societal expectation was that a woman's ultimate purpose was marriage and procreation. Her value to her family and to society was intrinsically linked to her ability to bear children, particularly male heirs, and to maintain an orderly and pious household. Higher education, as it was understood in the burgeoning university context, was simply not seen as contributing to these fundamental roles. In fact, it might even be viewed as a distraction or an impediment. A woman who spent her time engrossed in scholastic texts or philosophical debates would be seen as neglecting her primary duties. Her learning would have no practical application within the domestic sphere, where her knowledge of managing servants, preparing meals, or raising children was paramount. Consider the daily life of a medieval woman. For a peasant woman, her days were filled with relentless physical labor from dawn until dusk. She would be involved in every aspect of agricultural life, from sowing and harvesting to grinding grain and fetching water. Her life was one of survival and sustenance. There was simply no time, no energy, and certainly no societal expectation for her to pursue academic endeavor. Her survival and that of her family depended entirely on her physical labor and her ability to manage the household resources efficiently. For a noblewoman, while her life might be less physically demanding, her responsibilities were no less consuming. She was expected to be the mistress of her household, overseeing a complex array of servants, managing finances, organizing provisions, and maintaining the social and moral order of the domestic domain. She also played a crucial role in raising her children, teaching them basic piety and manners. Her social standing demanded that she be knowledgeable in etiquette, perhaps skilled in music or poetry, and certainly adept at managing the intricate web of household affairs. Again, these responsibilities, while requiring intelligence and skill, did not align with the academic curriculum of a university. The knowledge gained from a university, such as advanced Latin, logic, or legal principles, was simply irrelevant to her daily duties and expectations. The very concept of a career for a woman, outside of marriage and motherhood, was virtually non-existent. While some women might enter convents, where they could indeed pursue literacy and religious learning, this was a specific path of spiritual devotion, not a preparation for public professional life as understood by the emerging universities. Convents offered an alternative to marriage for some women, a place for spiritual contemplation and often significant intellectual engagement, but this was a separate system, largely unconnected to the male-dominated public universities. The education that women did receive, if any, was almost always geared towards making them better wives, mothers, or pious individuals within the confines of their accepted roles. Even literacy, which was not universal for women, was often pursued for the purpose of reading religious texts or managing household accounts. The idea of education for intellectual pursuit's sake, or as a pathway to public influence for women, was utterly foreign to the societal norms of 1188. In essence, the prevailing societal structures and the deeply ingrained expectations regarding women's roles created a powerful, almost invisible, barrier to their access to higher learning. The public sphere of universities was designed to train men for public roles. The private sphere of the home was the domain of women, and their education was deemed complete when it equipped them for that sphere. There was no social impetus, no cultural acceptance, and certainly no structural support for women to transcend these deeply etched boundaries. It was a world where a woman's place was defined by her household, and that definition left no room for a university education.